Imagine waking up tomorrow, just turning on the news and seeing that gas is instantly $5 a gallon.
Right.
You check your phone, but the broader internet backbone is just severely lagging.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like, this headline flashes, the U.S. government is suddenly slashing Social Security and Medicare. And not because of some, domestic policy debate, but simply to pay the skyrocketing interest on its own national debt.
It honestly sounds like the plot of a dystopian novel, right? But according to the military strategy we were analyzing today, it's actually a highly probable, mathematically modeled outcome.
Really?
Yeah, of literally just a single bomb being dropped in the Middle East.
Wow. Well, welcome to the deep dive. We know you.
Mm-hmm.
You're the kind of listener who doesn't just want the breaking news alert on your phone. You want to know the mechanics behind it. If
Exactly.
you want to understand the complex machinery of the world, free from the deafening partisan noise of cable news, you want to step inside the situation rooms and see the actual chessboard.
And today, we have an absolute masterclass in military strategy and geopolitics to unpack for you. And we're going to look at this strictly through the lens of objective analysis.
Yeah, we are pulling from this incredible stack of source material today. It's centered around the extensive commentary and strategic modeling of a leading military analyst and university professor.
Right. Someone who has spent 21 years,
Yeah,
over 2 decades.
2 decades.
Yeah, literally modeling a hypothetical U.S.-Iran war in his classrooms.
And the truly chilling part of this deep dive, that academic model, which has been running for 21 years on chalkboards, is now violently colliding with reality.
It's happening right now.
It is. Over the next hour, we're going to trace the exact path from a tactical military strike all the way to your wallet.
We'll examine why conventional military superiority is failing to achieve its objectives. We're going to walk through the 4 distinct stages of what the source calls the escalation track.
The escalation trap, right?
Yeah. And we'll analyze the shifting global balance of power and confront the incredibly grim geographical realities of a ground war.
Plus, we're also going to look at the catastrophic economic blowback. And finally, the domestic political cycles that are driving this entire chaotic engine.
It's a lot to cover.
It is a lot. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because I am trying to understand how a war that was modeled theoretically for 2 decades suddenly jumps off the page. Let's start with the bombing itself.
Okay, let's start there.
We all saw the recent headlines about Operation Midnight Hammer, right? The U.S. drops massive ordnance on Iranian nuclear facilities.
Right.
From a layman's perspective, a building is blown up, the target is destroyed, the mission is a success. But the source material suggests this entire approach is basically an illusion. How?
So to understand the illusion, we have to look past the concrete and basically look at the chemistry.
The chemistry.
Yeah. According to the professor's academic model, the U.S. approach to Iran's nuclear enrichment sites, places like Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan, it always yields the same initial highly visible result.
Yeah. Which is just a lot of destruction.
Exactly. The U.S. has B-2 bombers. They have massive ordnance air blasts, the MOABs.
Right.
Operation Midnight Hammer proved they can easily destroy the industrial facilities, but destroying the building, the centrifuges, the above-ground infrastructure, it doesn't actually destroy the threat.
Wait, if you blow up a nuclear facility, aren't you blowing up the nuclear material?
Not necessarily, no, and certainly not the material that matters. The core issue is the enriched uranium itself, specifically the uranium-235 isotope.
Okay, I'm going to need you to pause right there and explain the mechanics of that.
Yeah.
What exactly is a uranium-235 isotope, and why does it survive a MOA?
Let's break it down. When you mine raw uranium out of the earth, it's mostly uranium-238.
Okay.
Which is relatively stable and not useful for a reaction. Only a tiny fraction, less than 1%, is uranium-235. That's the highly reactive isotope you need for nuclear power or a weapon.
So how do they get it?
Well, to get that 235, you have to enrich it. You turn the uranium into a gas, pump it into these massive cylindrical machines called centrifuges, and you spin them at incredibly high speeds.
Oh, so it separates them.
Right. The heavier 238 pushes to the outside and the lighter 235 stays in the center. You siphon it off and you repeat that process thousands of times.
So you're just slowly accumulating this very specific, very dense material over time.
Exactly. Now, when a massive bomb hits that facility, sure, it shreds the centrifuges, collapses the roof, it burns the machinery. But the uranium-235 that has already been enriched and safely stored, it's a heavy metal. It doesn't just evaporate, it just gets buried.
Oh, wow. I was trying to wrap my head around this while reading the notes, and the analogy that came to mind is panning for gold.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
right? Like you've got the pan, the river, the whole mining operation,
Yeah.
and you've got these tiny, incredibly valuable gold nuggets.
Uh,
And the U.S. military drops a massive boulder on the entire operation. The pan is crushed. The river is dammed. But the gold nuggets, the U-235, they're still there.
Absolutely still there.
You haven't destroyed the gold, you've just pushed it into the rubble. Does that track?
That tracks perfectly, actually. The Iranians know exactly where that gold is under the rubble. When the dust settles, they can literally just dig it back up, undamaged, and they still have their enriched uranium.
So the bombing doesn't even work.
Not permanently, no. The U.S. military has effectively just kicked the can down the road. But what's fascinating here is the interaction between that military action and the ensuing political reaction.
What do you mean?
Well, bombing doesn't just destroy steel and concrete, it fundamentally alters human psychology.
Okay, but doesn't getting bombed heavily usually break an adversary's will to fight? I mean, that's the whole point of a bombing campaign, right?
It would think so. But the source material draws a brilliant historical parallel to the Vietnam War, specifically the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to prove otherwise.
Oh, right, the supply lines.
Yeah. Back in the 60s and 70s, the U.S. targeted the supply lines feeding the Viet Cong guerrillas in the South. The U.S. military, using absolutely overwhelming air power, successfully knocked out over 80% of the throughput on that trail.
I read that statistic in the source and had to do a double take. I mean, destroying 80% of an enemy's logistics is a crushing, decisive victory in almost any other context.
On paper, sure, it looks like a victory on a spreadsheet, but the reality on the ground was completely different.
How so?
The U.S. couldn't stop that remaining 15 to 20% of supplies from getting through, and here is the psychological kicker. The fact that the United States, with all of its unimaginable wealth and technology and air superiority, the fact that they couldn't stop that tiny fraction actually fueled the morale of the Viet Cong.
Wait, really? It made them fight harder.
Yes, it proved to them that the mighty U.S. military had limits. It energized them because they realized that despite the fire raining from the sky, they could survive. They couldn't be entirely beaten.
I see where this is going. If we apply that psychological framework to Iran today, the U.S. can destroy all those visible above-ground targets.
Right.
Operation Midnight Hammer takes out the airstrips, the radar dishes, the concrete buildings. But we know from the source that Iran has spent years deeply burying its most critical assets.
Deep underground.
Yeah, its arsenals of precision drones and ballistic missiles, just buried in subterranean caves and tunnels carved into mountains.
Which is why the daily press briefings from the Pentagon can be highly misleading if you don't understand this dynamic.
Because they're only talking about what they hit.
Exactly. The source notes that the U.S. has been hitting thousands of targets over the last month. The generals will step up to the podium and tout these massive numbers, like 11,000, 12,000 targets destroyed.
But the core threat is still there.
Yeah. Iran has secured that final 20% of their capabilities so deep underground that American bombs simply cannot reach them.
So Iran is in the exact same psychological position as the Viet Cong. They are watching thousands of bombs fall, but their core retaliatory strike force remains completely intact.
And that realization emboldens their entire strategy. They now know for a fact that the U.S. cannot entirely defeat them from the air.
Which means they have leverage.
They do. They know the U.S. cannot stop their drone attacks on global shipping lanes. Far from weakening Iran structurally for the long term, the academic model shows that this massive bombing campaign has paradoxically strengthened their resolve.
That is a staggering shift in perspective. It completely changes how we measure the concept of winning.
It really does.
Which brings us to the broader framework the source uses to map this entire conflict out. They call it the escalation trap.
Yes, the escalation trap.
And there are 4 distinct stages, right?
Okay.
I want to walk through these slowly because understanding this trap seems to be the key to decoding every single headline we are going to see over the next year. Let's start with stage 1.
Okay, so stage 1 is the initial phase we've been touching on. The U.S. uses its air power to bomb targets and attempts what military strategists call leadership decapitation.
Meaning going after the people in charge.
Right, trying to take out the top officials, the generals, the supreme leader. The working assumption in Washington is that under that kind of extreme pressure, the regime will fracture, panic, and ultimately collapse.
But that's the trap part, right?
Exactly. The trap is that the regime doesn't collapse. Instead, as we just discussed with the Vietnam parallel, it evolves, it adapts, and it emerges more cohesive.
I want to push back on that for a second, because during the transition from stage 1 to stage 2, there was this moment highlighted in the text involving the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth.
Oh, yes, the press conference.
Right. He was asked by reporters about Iranian attacks continuing despite a supposed ceasefire being discussed, and his response was basically to mock them.
Right.
He said something to the effect of, Iran would be wise to find a way to get their carrier pigeon to the troops out in remote locations to let them know not to shoot.
Mm-hmm.
He was explicitly implying that Iran's leadership is totally chaotic, that the decapitation strikes worked, and they have no centralized control left.
And that quote is a perfect example of a massive intelligence failure. The source material heavily critiques that exact assumption.
Because it's not actually chaos.
No, not at all. The expert analysis proves that this continued firing isn't chaos. It is deliberate, decentralized military execution.
How does that work in practice? I mean, if a local commander loses communication with Tehran, how do they know what to do without it just being rogue chaos?
Well, when you move up the chain of command in a modern, capable military structure, leaders utilize what are called pre-delegated orders.
Pre-delegated orders, okay.
Yeah. They know their communications might be jammed or their headquarters might be destroyed, so they give specific orders in advance.
Like what?
For example, they might say, if communication is lost for 24 hours and you detect U.S. naval movement in your sector, you are pre-authorized to launch a drone strike on these specific coordinates.
Ah, so it's an if-then statement programmed right into the human chain of command.
Exactly. The fact that local Iranian commanders are executing attacks without needing to, dial a phone back to Tehran for permission, it doesn't mean the government has collapsed.
Right, it means the opposite.
Right. It means they possess a highly resilient, decentralized structure designed specifically to survive U.S. communication blackouts and decapitation strikes.
The text points out a really dark irony here. The real chaotic decision-making isn't happening in the mountains of Iran. It's happening in the U.S. White House.
Which is a stark contrast.
Yeah, we're seeing erratic policy shifts, conflicting statements about ceasefires from different cabinet members, reversing positions on negotiations daily.
Yep.
The source suggests that by calling the Iranian military a carrier pigeon operation, the U.S. is literally projecting its own internal political chaos onto a highly organized adversary.
And operating under that false assumption that your enemy is disorganized and crumbling, that drags you right into stage 2 of the escalation trap.
Which is?
Stage 2 is horizontal escalation. The newly strengthened Iranian regime lashes back. But they don't do it by launching a suicidal direct attack on the U.S. homeland.
What do they do instead?
They project power horizontally by taking control of the Strait of Hormuz, essentially putting a chokehold on the global economy.
Which forces the U.S. to react, triggering Stage 3.
Yes, Stage 3 is the realization phase.
Oh.
The U.S. military realizes that air power alone cannot reopen the strait, and they cannot reach the deeply buried missiles. The trap snaps shut, forcing the U.S. to seriously consider the one thing it wants to avoid.
Ground options.
Ground options. Boots on the ground to take the strait back by force.
And if they fail or get bogged down, we hit Stage 4.
Right. Stage 4 is the culmination. Through this grueling process of surviving U.S. attacks, demonstrating resilience, and controlling a vital global choke point, Iran emerges not as a defeated regional nuisance, but as a recognized, formidable fourth center of world power.
So what does this all mean for the current global order? Because if we are violently oscillating between Stage 3, prepping for a ground war, and Stage 4, Iran becoming a global power, we have to look at the geography of this chokehold.
Geography is everything here.
Right. For a lot of listeners, the Strait of Hormuz is just, a tiny blue sliver on a map of the Middle East. Why is this specific body of water the geopolitical fulcrum of the entire world right now?
To understand the Strait of Hormuz, you have to understand its physical dimensions and its economic weight. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide.
That's incredibly narrow.
It is. But the actual shipping lanes that massive supertankers can safely navigate, they are only 2 miles wide in each direction.
Wait, 2 miles. For the whole global oil supply.
It is an incredibly narrow bottleneck, and according to the source material, 80 to 90% of the shipping that goes through that incredibly narrow strait is headed straight to Asia.
And this is where military action reshapes diplomacy, right? Because once Iran uses its surviving decentralized drone fleet to selectively blockade that 2-mile lane, key U.S. allies suddenly realize how incredibly vulnerable they are.
Exactly. Let's look at India and Japan, which the source highlights specifically. Historically, the United States expects these allied nations to fall in line, issue joint statements condemning Iran, and support American military pressure.
But they aren't doing that.
Right now, we're seeing the opposite. They're actively distancing themselves from the U.S.
Because they physically cannot survive without the energy flowing through that strait. I mean, it's not just about gas being expensive for them, it's about the grid shutting down.
Yes. For a country like India, with over 1 billion people, an interruption in energy supply is an existential threat to the state. Japan is in a similar position.
The source mentions a specific meeting, right?
Yeah, the source details a fascinating instance where the former U.S. president brought the Japanese leader into the Oval Office.
Oh.
The goal was to apply maximum diplomatic pressure to get Japan to commit to the U.S. coalition against Iran. And the Japanese leader simply wouldn't budge. She refused to provide military support.
Because if she angers Iran, Iran stops a supertanker heading to Tokyo, and Japan goes dark.
Exactly.
That is real, raw geopolitical power. Iran is using geography to pry America's closest Asian allies away from Washington.
And the fracturing of alliances isn't just happening in Asia. The source provides a deeply detailed analysis of the absolute collapse of the Gulf coalition right in the Middle East.
Which is huge because the U.S. has relied on that coalition for decades.
Decades, yes. For a very long time, the U.S. has maintained this massive web of alliances acting as a counterweight to Iranian influence. The U.S. built sprawling, state-of-the-art military bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia.
But the text notes that those bases are no longer viewed as assets by the host countries. They're now viewed as massive liabilities.
Because they are above-ground targets. We go back to stage 1 of the trap.
Oh, right. Iran buried its weapons.
Yes. Iran buried its weapons. But the U.S. built sprawling, visible, multi-billion-dollar complexes right there in the desert. To a locally stationed Iranian drone commander with pre-delegated orders, a U.S. base in Bahrain is a sitting duck.
You know, I'm trying to figure out how a coalition that has held together for decades just evaporates so quickly. I know these Gulf states are terrified of being caught in the crossfire, but didn't the U.S. promise to protect them?
Well, the source introduces a concept to explain this called a military anchor. For any regional coalition of smaller, vulnerable states to work, one superpower has to be the absolute, unquestioned guarantor of safety.
Like a big brother.
The source actually likens it to a protection racket or a mafia boss dynamic.
Okay, so the smaller countries pay their dues by hosting the bases and buying U.S. weapons. And in return, the boss guarantees that if anyone messes with them, the full weight of the U.S. military will come down on the aggressor.
Precisely. The United States has successfully played that mafia boss role in the Gulf since the end of the Cold War. But the current analysis notes a critical shift.
What changed?
The U.S., under its current domestic pressures, isn't willing to absorb casualties to defend those bases or those allies from Iranian drone swarms. The U.S. rhetoric has essentially shifted to telling Saudi Arabia and the UAE, you need to defend yourselves.
And the second the mafia boss says defend yourselves, the protection racket shatters.
Exactly.
Why would a small Gulf state paint a target on its back by hosting American troops if the Americans won't shield them from the fallout?
They wouldn't. The anchor is gone. And without the anchor, the coalition dissolves instantly. The source material outlines how the Middle East is rapidly fracturing into 3 distinct new pools of influence as a direct result of the U.S. stepping back from this guarantor role.
Let's run through those 3 pools because this completely redraws the map of the Middle East we've known for 20 years. Pool number 1 is Iraq.
Right. And keep in mind the historical context here. The U.S. military overthrew Saddam Hussein, occupied the country, and essentially installed the framework for the current Iraqi government in 2003.
So they should be a staunch ally.
You'd think so. But despite that massive investment of blood and treasure, Iraq is now actively complaining about the remaining U.S. military presence. They are officially distancing themselves from Washington and being pulled into Iran's orbit.
That has to be a bitter pill for U.S. strategists to swallow. Then we have pool number 2, which involves Qatar and Oman.
Qatar is currently trying to play an incredibly delicate game of neutrality, basically keeping its head down to avoid the crossfire.
Which makes sense. What about Oman?
Oman is actively making moves. Oman shares the Strait of Hormuz with Iran. The source notes that Iran is actually engaging in high-level negotiations to share transit tolls from the strait directly with Oman.
Wait, really?
Yeah. So Oman is being pulled directly into a lucrative shared economic sphere of influence with Iran, actively circumventing U.S. sanctions.
And then there's the third pool. And I found this the most alarming in the entire text. Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Historically, these are the strongest, most heavily armed U.S. partners in the region.
But according to the source, Saudi Arabia has realized the U.S. will not protect its oil infrastructure from Iranian drones. So they recently signed a major security deal with Pakistan.
Pakistan,
Uh,
a country that is an ally of Iran. And more importantly, a country with a massive arsenal of nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia is turning to a nuclear-armed state to be their new guarantor of security instead of the United States.
It is a stunning historic realignment. As U.S. influence recedes because it can no longer guarantee security, regional players are desperately seeking new anchors.
And Iran is taking advantage of that.
Completely. Through its unbroken drone arsenals and its control of the Strait, Iran is elevating itself into a position where it commands deference from all three of these pools.
That's stage 4.
This is the exact pathway to stage 4, Iran establishing itself as a fourth center of world power alongside the U.S., Russia, and China.
That is heavy. And it brings up a vital question. If the military options are traps, how did diplomacy fail so spectacularly?
It's a key question.
In the source material, there is a very detailed, heavily researched analysis of the intelligence leading up to this crisis, specifically focusing on the role of Israel in the negotiation process.
Right.
And listener, just a quick reminder here as we dive into this next part. Our mission is to analyze the strategic cause and effect strictly as outlined in the academic modeling provided to us.
We're looking at the geopolitical chessboard objectively.
Right, evaluating the strategic moves and intelligence failures without endorsing or condemning any political figure or nation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the source material explicitly analyzes Israel's strategic actions as a diplomatic spoiler in this conflict.
The spoiler.
Yeah. The core argument presented in the text is that at critical junctures, precisely when diplomatic off-ramps were being carefully constructed by the U.S., external military strikes derailed them.
The text cites 3 very specific, chronologically documented instances of this. Let's walk through them. First, during the 12-day war last June, the source details that the U.S., under the previous administration, was actually quietly planning to negotiate with a specific set of Iranian officials to de-escalate the region.
But the text notes that within 36 hours of that diplomatic intention becoming clear through back channels, strikes were launched that killed the exact Iranian negotiators the U.S. was scheduled to meet with.
Wow.
From a purely functional standpoint, a superpower cannot negotiate a ceasefire if its counterparts keep being assassinated on the eve of a meeting.
Then we have the second instance, the February 28th strikes. According to the source, the U.S. was engaged in delicate, behind-the-scenes diplomacy, specifically trying to empower the doves, or the more moderate, reformist voices within the Iranian government who might be open to a new nuclear deal.
But on February 28th, massive strikes were launched that killed the supreme leader and dozens of those exact moderate figures.
So the people they were trying to empower were wiped out.
Yes. The source references statements from the U.S. Secretary of State explaining that this external action essentially backed the U.S. into a corner. Because of the sheer scale of the assassination, America was politically forced to launch a reactionary, supportive air campaign to follow up.
Which completely vaporized the diplomatic route they had been cultivating.
Exactly.
And then the third instance, which is perhaps the most direct spoiler, happened on March 17th. An airstrike killed an Iranian official named Ali Larijani. Who was he?
Ali Larijani was highly significant to the diplomatic track. According to the analysis in the text, he was U.S. leadership's primary trusted contact for negotiating a comprehensive 10-point peace proposal.
Oh, wow.
The source notes that the former president had publicly stated his belief that they were inches away from signing a massive, historic diplomatic deal.
But then Larijani was killed.
Right. Before that specific assassination removed Larijani from the board, resetting the diplomatic clock to 0.
So, as someone looking at this from the outside, I have to ask, how does the U.S. foreign policy establishment allow this to happen? How can a superpower operate effectively when its allies are independently altering the battlefield and erasing its diplomatic options?
The source traces this back to a massive collision of conflicting intelligence assessments.
How so?
Well, you have Israel's public rhetorical stance, which has consistently framed Iran to the U.S. as a paper tiger.
A paper tiger, meaning they're all bark, no bite.
Right. The narrative sold to Washington is that Iran is a weak, crippled regime, hated by its own people, just waiting for one final push to topple completely.
But the 21-year academic modeling we are discussing proves the exact opposite.
Yes. The source is absolutely adamant that underestimating Iran's resilience, its deeply decentralized command structure, and its strategic geographic depth is the fundamental, fatal flaw of the broader foreign policy establishment.
Because if you think they're weak, you act like they're weak.
Exactly. When you operate on the assumption that your enemy is a paper tiger, You launch strikes expecting them to crumble. When they don't crumble and instead they shut down the Strait of Hormuz, you suddenly find yourself trapped in an escalation cycle you have no plan for.
Which drags us kicking and screaming right into stage 3 of the trap, the ground war.
Grandma, yes.
If air power is an illusion, and diplomacy is being actively spoiled, and the global economy is suffocating because the Strait of Hormuz is choked off, the military logic dictates that the only way to physically stop Iran, secure the U-235, and open the shipping lanes is to send in massive ground forces.
It seems like the only logical military step left.
But the source describes the physical geography of Iran as an absolute nightmare for an invading army. Why can't the U.S. just march in?
Let's look at a topographical map and walk the borders.
Right.
If the U.S. wants to move hundreds of thousands of troops, heavy armor, and logistics into a mountainous country like Iran, they need a safe, massive staging area in a neighboring country.
Right, they need a base of operations right next door.
Exactly. So where do they start? You look east of Pakistan. But the source reminds us of a critical piece of history. Pakistan is a staunch ally of Iran.
Oh, right.
In fact, it was the Pakistani AQ Khan network that secretly gave Iran 600 centrifuges back in 2002 to jumpstart their nuclear enrichment program. Plus, Pakistan is a sovereign nuclear power. Demanding to stage a U.S. invasion from Pakistani soil is completely off the table.
Okay, what about Afghanistan to the east? The U.S. was there for 20 years.
The source rules Afghanistan out entirely. Since the U.S. withdrawal, the infrastructure and logistical hubs required to sustain a massive American mobilization simply do not exist there anymore. It's a logistical dead end.
What about the north? The text mentions Azerbaijan.
Historically, military planners viewed Azerbaijan, which shares a northern border with Iran, as the ideal staging area to push armored divisions south toward Tehran. But the academic model points out a brilliant, terrifying tactical move by Iran. On day one of this recent conflict, a single missile hit Azerbaijan.
I remember that being dismissed on the news as a misfire.
It was widely dismissed by cable news pundits as a random error. But the military analyst in our source saw it for what it truly was, a highly targeted warning shot.
To scare them off.
Right. Iran was demonstrating to the Azerbaijani leadership that they could hit their capital with precision if they cooperated with the U.S. And it worked flawlessly. Azerbaijan immediately issued statements declaring strict neutrality and explicitly refused to let the U.S. use their territory as a staging ground.
So the land borders are completely sealed off by geography and Iranian diplomacy. That leaves the coast to the south, the Persian Gulf.
Which leads the source to conclude that the only viable military option remaining is a massive amphibious marine assault.
Like D-Day.
We're talking about D-Day style landings, yes. Either near the Strait of Hormuz to clear the coastline or pushing up through the southwestern oil fields to secure the energy reserves.
But the geographical photos referenced in the text describe the terrain around the strait as a literal moonscape.
It's incredibly hostile terrain.
It is treacherous, mountainous, deeply unforgiving rock. It's not a sandy beach in Normandy. Trying to establish a beachhead there sounds like a bloodbath.
It would be.
And this is where I really struggle to square the military reality with the political rhetoric. The source analyzes statements from U.S. leadership, openly musing about taking the Iranian oil fields, saying, to the victor belong the spoils.
Right.
They want to seize the physical wealth of the country, but in the same breath, they talk about what their political base wants, which is to just win quickly and come home.
The source highlights that as a fundamental, unresolvable contradiction. You cannot permanently seize, hold, and extract resources from hundreds of miles of hostile mountainous terrain and also come home.
Right, you have to stay there forever.
Exactly. If Marines land on those moonscape beaches, they're going to face deeply entrenched, pre-delegated drone swarms and ballistic missiles. There will be significant casualties.
And my immediate thought, and I think the thought of any listener who has watched U.S. politics over the last 20 years, is that the moment body bags start returning home, the American public will demand an immediate retreat. People don't have the stomach for a new Middle Eastern ground war.
This raises an important question, and it's a political paradox that the source deeply analyzes. The common logical assumption is exactly what you just articulated, that military casualties equal a domestic demand for retreat.
Yeah.
But the historical reality of how military force interacts with domestic politics tells a very different, much darker story.
Are we going back to the Vietnam parallel?
Yes.
You know,
And we can look at later conflicts as well.
right.
When American troops die in a foreign theater, it rarely causes the political base, the core 36% or so, that staunchly supports the sitting president, to advocate for a withdrawal.
What does it do?
It causes them to violently double down.
Because to pull out and retreat would mean admitting to themselves that those soldiers died for absolutely nothing. It's the sunk cost fallacy applied to human lives.
Exactly. The psychological and political demand rapidly becomes a cry to finish the job, to honor the sacrifice of the fallen.
Oh, wow.
You cannot be the president who orders a retreat right after taking heavy losses. You would be crucified by your own party. So a limited beachhead operation to secure an oil field or a quick mission to open the strait, it inevitably spirals.
It becomes a quagmire.
The source models that the moment you commit ground forces and take those initial casualties, you are politically locked into a minimum of a grueling, deeply entrenched 6-month ground war, purely driven by the domestic inability to retreat.
That is a terrifying feedback loop. You get stuck in stage 3 because leaving looks like losing.
Right.
And speaking of terrifying, I want to pivot to the actual language and rhetoric being used by leadership in this conflict, which the source text spends significant time dissecting. We are hearing apocalyptic language on the news, actual phrases being thrown around casually about ending a civilization tonight.
It is critical to understand that the military analyst in the source frames this rhetoric not as mere political hyperbole or tough talk for the cameras. He frames it as a chilling, technical reality.
The reality.
Yes. When the President of the United States makes a statement about ending a civilization, they are one of the only human beings on Earth with the physical hardware standing by to instantly back it up.
The text lists the actual specs of that hardware. The U.S. currently has 500 Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles sitting in silos. The warheads on these missiles have a yield between 100 and 300 kilotons.
Just for context, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was about 15 kilotons.
So we are talking about hundreds of weapons, each multiple times more powerful than the bombs that ended World War II.
And here is the truly scary part outlined in the model. These missiles can be retargeted to any coordinates on Earth in 45 minutes, and they can strike those targets in 25 minutes.
So when we talk about a civilization-ending event, we are talking about a technical reality that is always just 70 minutes away from a single human decision.
Yes. But the source also analyzes an alternative strategy that the military considers conventional, meaning non-nuclear, yet practically speaking, it is just as apocalyptic for the society it hits.
Infrastructure bombing?
Exactly. Infrastructure bombing. Specifically, the strategy of taking down the entire Iranian national power grid.
This part of the deep dive really stuck with me because it moves away from abstract military terms and gets incredibly tangible. The analyst explains that the Iranian electrical grid, like most modern grids, relies on massive generating hulls.
Right. These giant, highly specialized turbines that spin to create electricity.
There are maybe 130 of these critical nodes in the entire country. But the model shows that if the U.S. military targets just the top 10 generating hulls, the cascade failure collapses the entire national network.
And the crucial detail here is that these are not off-the-shelf parts. These are custom-built, massive pieces of heavy machinery. You don't have backups sitting in a warehouse.
Right.
If a MOI destroys a generating hull, you have to custom order a new one from a global manufacturer, ship it, and install it.
Which means the power wouldn't just be out for a few days while crews work on power lines. The entire country would lose electricity for a minimum of 6 to 18 months.
And we have to translate what a nationwide total blackout for over a year actually means on the ground for a modern society.
Right. Let's pause the geopolitical chess game for a second and just focus on the human element. I want you, the listener, to really picture this. Imagine your life right now, your city, without power for a year.
It's hard to even fathom.
No lights, no internet, no gas pumps. Imagine living under the credible daily threat that your entire civilization could be vaporized 70 minutes from now. What does that do to the psyche of the 92 million ordinary everyday people who live in Iran, who are just caught in the crossfire of these superpower games?
The humanitarian cost modeled in the source is beyond devastating. Think about the immediate cascading effects. When the power grid dies for 6 months, every dialysis machine in the country stops working. All complex, life-saving hospital surgeries cease. The national food supply, which relies entirely on commercial refrigeration in warehouses and grocery stores, spoils within a week.
So you're looking at mass starvation.
You face immediate, widespread malnutrition across tens of millions of people. which makes the population highly susceptible to rampant disease. The source plainly states that the life expectancy across the entire nation of 92 million people would measurably and permanently drop.
It's essentially bombing a country back into the Middle Ages. And from a strategic perspective, if we force ourselves to ignore the horrific human cost for a moment, the source argues that this infrastructure bombing strategy is actually the ultimate backfire for long-term U.S. interests. Why?
If we connect this back to the psychology of survival we discussed earlier, we look at the internal politics of Iran. Before this conflict escalated, there was a robust, brave, pro-democracy, anti-regime movement within Iran.
Right, people who want to change.
The U.S. stated goal has traditionally been to empower that movement, hoping the people would overthrow the government themselves. But when an external power threatens 92 million people with total nuclear annihilation, or plunges them into a dark ages scenario of starvation and disease, that domestic pro-democracy movement dies instantly.
Because philosophical debates about democracy don't matter when you are starving. The primal survival instinct takes over.
Exactly. The historical model is ironclad on this. When faced with an external threat of total destruction, a population fiercely bonds with its regime out of sheer survival.
Even if they hated them before.
Even citizens who deeply hated the government yesterday will suddenly look to it today for protection and retaliation. The source concludes that these apocalyptic threats have actually guaranteed that the Iranian populace will now actively support their government crossing the threshold to acquire a nuclear weapon.
As a deterrent.
Yes, viewing it as the only viable, ultimate deterrent to keep their families alive.
It achieves the exact opposite of the intended effect. It forces the creation of a nuclear state. So if bombing is an illusion that breeds resilience and a ground war is a political nightmare, and infrastructure bombing unites the enemy, what are the alternative? Is there a diplomatic way out of stage 3 before it becomes a global catastrophe?
Well, in the source material, there's a detailed discussion of Iran formally offering a 10-point proposal to the United States.
And as I read it, this proposal is essentially a blueprint for stage 4. Iran demanding formal validation as a world power.
Let's look at exactly what Iran is reportedly demanding in this 10-point plan.
Okay.
A permanent, verifiable ceasefire. The complete lifting of all U.S. primary and secondary sanctions, allowing them back into the global banking system.
That's a huge ask.
It is. Crucially, they demand the right to keep their currently enriched uranium capped at 3.5%. They want massive war reparations from the U.S. for the bombing damage to their infrastructure, and they want the termination of all outstanding UN resolutions against them.
That is a massive list of concessions. But the centerpiece of the proposal, the real leverage, involves the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes.
Iran offers to reopen the shipping lanes to global traffic, but with a massive catch. Iran demands the right to charge a $2 million toll per ship that passes through, and they will split that revenue with Oman.
They are basically setting up a heavily armed toll booth on the central artery of the global economy.
And that proposal brings us directly to the global economic impact of this entire crisis.
It does.
Here's where it gets really interesting. And because up to this point, we've been talking about military maneuvers, missile silos, and geography thousands of miles away. It can feel abstract.
Right.
But the source material draws a direct mathematical line from the Strait of Hormuz to your wallet, your savings account, and your taxes. It all comes down to the nature of oil markets. Now, the U.S. produces a lot of its own energy, and we don't buy Iranian oil directly. So a listener might think, why do we care if the strait is closed?
Because the global oil market doesn't work like a local grocery store. It is a perfectly fungible global pool.
A pool.
Yeah, it functions like a giant swimming pool of water. If you drain a massive amount of water from the deep end, the water level drops everywhere, including the shallow end. It doesn't matter where the water was removed.
Right.
Iran, through its own exports and its control of the strait, effectively holds hostage roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply.
And the economic model shows that if that 20% comes off the market due to a sustained blockade or a ground war, you don't just see a gentle, gradual curve in gas prices. The source describes the economic reaction as a sheer cliff.
And the text adds a terrifying geopolitical multiplier to that cliff. We have to consider Russia.
Oh, right.
What if Russia, seeing a golden opportunity to severely damage the U.S. economy while America is distracted, tactically colludes with Iran? Russia controls another 11% of the global oil supply.
So if they collude...
If Russia holds back its exports in solidarity with an Iranian blockade, suddenly over 30% of the world's energy supply vanishes overnight. The shockwaves are unimaginable.
So let's translate that macroeconomic cliff into everyday reality. The source uses a very specific example. Gas prices in a city like Chicago jumping rapidly from $3.10 to $4.60 a gallon.
Oh.
But as painful as that is at the pump, that is just the most visible, superficial tip of the iceberg, right?
It's the tip of the iceberg because literally everything in a modern economy runs on energy. When fuel costs skyrocket by 50%, the cost of transporting food to the grocery store explodes.
Delivery fees go up.
The cost of running manufacturing plants explodes. The cost of flying planes, shipping Amazon packages, operating server farms, it all surges simultaneously.
Which triggers massive cascading inflation across every single sector of the economy. And when inflation spikes, the Federal Reserve and central banks are forced to react by raising interest rates to cool the economy down.
Right.
The force models a highly probable scenario where bond yields, which dictate the interest rates on borrowed money, like your mortgage, surge rapidly from, say, 4% to 7 or 8%.
And why does a surge in interest rates matter so critically to the United States government? Because the U.S. currently sits on roughly $40 trillion in national debt.
And this is the trap snapping shut on the American public. If interest rates spike dramatically because of this oil shock, the cost for the U.S. government to simply service that existing debt just to pay the monthly interest doubles or triples.
Precisely. Debt servicing would instantly become the single biggest item in the entire federal budget, dwarfing the military budget, dwarfing education. It crowds out every other function of government.
The source explicitly warns that to avoid defaulting on the national debt, the government would be forced to make devastating immediate cuts to massive domestic programs. We're talking about gutting Social Security,
Slashing Medicare and Medicaid.
stopping infrastructure projects. This isn't theoretical fear-mongering. The source lays out the exact macroeconomic math of how a regional war in the Middle East literally bankrupts a superpower at home.
It forces an impossible choice on the American public. Fund an unwinnable, grueling war in the Middle East, or fund the retirement and health care of your own citizens. It is a catastrophic scenario that hollows out the middle class entirely.
Staring down the barrel of economic ruin, a grueling ground war, and an adversary on the brink of nuclear capability.
What was the off-ramp?
How does the U.S. get out of this without triggering a depression?
The source suggests an off-ramp, a diplomatic counteroffer, but it is radical.
Radical how?
It is deeply radical, and it underscores just how few good options remain on the table. The expert analysis in the source suggests a grand bargain that would require the enforced military containment of Israel.
Wait, meaning the U.S. Congress would have to pass a binding law legally cutting off all military, intelligence, and economic funds to Israel if they preemptively attack Iran?
Yes. The logic of the model is that to get Iran to surrender its nuclear ambitions and permanently open the strait, you have to provide them with an ironclad enforceable guarantee of security.
So they feel safe disarming.
They have to believe they won't be bombed the moment they disarm. Furthermore, the source suggests this radical deal would have to force Israel to officially join the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT.
I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of that. Joining the NPT would mean Israel has to officially acknowledge its nuclear arsenal and allow the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, to actively and continuously monitor its Dimona nuclear plant, right?
Exactly. The goal would be to balance the verification measures. If the IAEA monitors Iran, they monitor Israel. It creates a stabilized, transparent regional balance of power.
I hear the logic in the academic model, but I have to ask, is this off-ramp actually plausible in the real world? Given U.S. domestic politics, given the power of the lobbying groups in Washington, given the rhetoric of the current administration, passing a law to defund an ally and force them into the NPT sounds politically impossible. No politician would survive that vote.
This raises an important question about the boundaries of diplomacy versus domestic reality. The source openly acknowledges this is highly unlikely to be accepted in the current hyper-partisan political climate.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
But the analyst is making a crucial point. We are entirely out of good or easy options. The choices on the menu are no longer between a clean win and a minor loss. The choices left are between bad, worse, and catastrophic.
And the source traces the root of this impossible situation back to a specific decision, what they call the original sin of recent U.S. foreign policy, the decision to rip up the Obama-era nuclear deal in 2018.
Yes. The analysis argues that by abandoning that functioning diplomatic framework, the U.S. set off an unstoppable reactive enrichment cycle.
Because it broke the trust.
It destroyed the trust required for baseline negotiations, leading directly to this current crisis where Iran feels vindicated, deeply entrenched, and absolutely will not negotiate away its 3.5% enriched uranium without demanding massive, regime-altering global concessions.
The leverage the U.S. had in 2015 is gone. And it's not just leverage over adversaries like Iran that has been lost. The source has a very grim, unsparing assessment of America's closest historical alliances, specifically NATO.
The quote in the text regarding NATO is brutal. The expert analyst calls the alliance a body in the morgue, just completely dead, waiting for the autopsy.
That is a shocking statement. NATO is supposed to be the bedrock of Western security. How is it dead?
To understand why the analyst makes that claim, you have to understand how NATO actually operates mechanically, specifically under Article 5.
Okay.
NATO is not a democratic roundtable where all member nations vote equally on military strategy and then hold hands. In reality, NATO functions as a strict top-down hierarchy. An American general, usually the supreme allied commander, devises the strategy and gives the orders.
And the allied European militaries are expected to fall in line and execute the plan.
Exactly. But the source argues that after watching the catastrophic failure of U.S. policy over the last 2 decades, the shifting rationales for war, the economic damage to global markets, the erratic decision-making in Washington, European leaders have completely lost faith in that hierarchy.
Completely. Think about it from their perspective. European populations are the ones who will suffer most acutely from a massive energy crisis.
Right. They rely far more heavily on imported oil and gas than the U.S. does.
For a European leader like the UK Prime Minister or the German Chancellor to blindly follow a U.S. general into a volatile Middle Eastern war that is guaranteed to wreck their own economies and freeze their citizens in winter, it's seen as domestic political suicide.
The European public simply won't stand for it anymore.
So without the fundamental trust in U.S. leadership to act as a stable, rational anchor, the alliance becomes a hollow shell. They might share intelligence, but they won't bleed for American foreign policy errors.
That's the reality of it.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground here, from the molecular level of uranium enrichment to the macroeconomics of global oil markets. Let's try to pull this all together.
It's a lot to synthesize.
Because the overarching theme of the source material is that the United States is currently trapped. We are wedged tightly between launching a grueling, politically disastrous ground war in a moonscape or conceding to a new global power order where an emboldened Iran holds massive recognized influence.
And if we want to truly understand this deep dive, we have to ask why. Why does the U.S. keep finding itself walking blindly into these geopolitical traps?
Yeah, how does this keep happening?
The source looks past the military tactics and identifies a domestic root cause for this erratic foreign policy. They introduce a fascinating concept called the legitimacy shock cycle.
The legitimacy shock cycle. Let's break that down for the listener. What exactly is that?
Essentially, it describes the structural flaw in how modern American democracy interacts with long-term global statecraft. The U.S. electorate, constantly frustrated with economic struggles or bad outcomes abroad, keeps bouncing violently between extreme political poles.
You elect a candidate who promises radical, sweeping change.
They come into office and immediately implement a highly disruptive, ideologically driven foreign policy.
Which inevitably creates a global crisis because the international system relies on stability.
Right. The crisis hits, gas prices surge, inflation spikes. The American public gets angry at the pain. So in the very next election cycle, they vote in the complete opposite extreme to punish the incumbent.
And that new administration comes in, immediately rips up the previous treaties like the Iran nuclear deal or climate accords and implements a completely new, equally radical shift in the opposite direction.
So American foreign policy becomes this violent, unpredictable pendulum swing every 4 to 8 years.
And the source argues that you simply cannot maintain complex global alliances or deter long-term adversaries like China or Russia if your entire geopolitical strategy gets thrown out the window and rewritten every single election cycle.
Nobody trusts a partner who changes their core identity every 4 years.
Exactly. The solution presented by the professor in the source material is, frankly, unsexy. It won't make for a viral campaign slogan.
No, it won't.
But he argues it is mathematically and strategically vital for national survival. He argues that voters must actively organize and support centrist, pragmatic candidates, not necessarily because they agree with every single mundane policy, but to forcefully stabilize the system.
To stop the violent pendulum swings and reestablish a consistent, predictable statecraft that allies can rely on and adversaries can understand.
It's about breaking the domestic escalation trap to fix the international one. We have to stop setting our own house on fire before we can put out fires in the Middle East.
That's beautifully put.
And I think that is the perfect place to tie this all back to you, the listener. Because when we spend an hour talking about U-235 centrifuges and geographical choke points in the Strait of Hormuz and 10-point diplomatic proposals and NATO Article 5, it can sound like abstract, high-level strategy played by people in suits thousands of miles away.
It can feel like a movie that doesn't affect your reality.
But the academic modeling proves that it isn't abstract at all. The line between a bomb dropping in the desert and your daily life is incredibly short.
It's not abstract. The decisions made regarding those invisible, deeply buried uranium centrifuges dictate the exact price of the groceries you're going to buy next week.
And the failure to secure a diplomatic off-ramp dictates the interest rate on the mortgage you are trying to pay off right now. The illusion that bombing solves everything dictates whether the global economic system that keeps the lights on in your city remains stable or collapses under the weight of debt.
Every tactical military strike, every failed negotiation reverberates directly through the global economy and lands right on your doorstep.
Exactly. Which brings us all the way back to where we started. We thought we were looking at a simple problem. We thought dropping a massive bomb on a concrete target was a precise binary solution to a complex threat.
But the reality revealed in the source material is a deeply connected, fragile, highly reactive global system.
A system where pulling one seemingly isolated lever in the Middle East crushes a vital gear in Washington, shatters an alliance in Europe, and bankrupts a working family in Chicago.
So we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day.
We've spent the last hour dissecting how military action shapes global politics and economics. But as we watch these extreme policies hollow out the middle class, fracture historical alliances, and push the world towards sheer economic cliffs, you have to wonder.
Is the real existential threat to a superpower's survival the enemies it drops bombs on abroad?
Or is it the endless, exhausting, self-destructive cycle of political whiplash it creates at home?
It's a question we all need to be asking before the next shock hits the system.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking past the headlines to understand the mechanics underneath, and we will see you next time.